Muy buenos días. Ya voy a empezar, gracias a ustedes que pudieron acudir hoy en persona y los virtuales. También les mando un gran saludo desde San Francisco y vamos a empezar. La presentación lo voy a hacer en inglés. So, in a word, what this study is about, this book that I wrote, is indigenous knowledges, and specifically Nahua knowledge. I first heard the name Nahua, an indigenous culture in Mexico, with their language of Nahuatl, when it was in the year 2000, and I was an undergraduate. I studied as an exchange student at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And we had a tour guide there, and he took us out, and he was talking about the Nahuas and their culture and their language. And for a few years, it sat with me, and I was trying to understand a little bit and put pieces together. And it was later on in life, about 5 or 6 years later, when I decided that I really needed to go back to grad school and finish this. So that's when I started really studying in more detail. So, 900 years ago, groups of Nahuatl speakers migrated from the regions of what is now northwest Mexico to central Mexico. These ancestral groups, from prior to European colonialism, settled central highlands of Mesoamerica and included groups in Texcoco, Tacuba, and the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, Cholula, and Azcapotzalco. Nahuatl was the language of the Aztec Empire and the Aztecs, or the Mexica as they called themselves. They were the most famous subgroup of the Nahuatl cultural zone in central Mexico. During the colonial period, Nahuatl, and not Spanish, was the lingua franca. So oftentimes we think, well, the Spaniards came and rolled over everything. The Spaniards were actually a numerical minority, and it was not practical for them to try to impose Spanish. So they needed interpreters, and they required priests and functionaries to learn Nahuatl. Okay, so during the colonial period, fusion of the language starts to occur, and words like aguacatl, chocolate, and xitomac all come from Nahuatl. Today, some 1.5 million Nahuatl speakers who descend from those early migrations from the north live in communities from Zacatecas to El Salvador in Central America. And there are even diasporic communities who speak the language in Los Angeles, San Diego, and other U.S. cities. The map here shows the full extent of the use of the language combined with the larger Uto-Aztecan family of languages, which reaches as far north as the Paiute in the Rocky Mountains. So we have such a strong regional heritage here that there are so many things that we take for granted, which actually are Mesoamerican or specifically Nahua, that are already part of our habits. So 11 years after my first exposure to the historical importance of the Nahua, I began studying their language of Nahuatl during a summer course at Vanderbilt University. There in a lecture, one of the top non-indigenous scholars of Nahuatl, John Sullivan, who's lived for years in the Huasteca and lived in Chicontepec, very, very close to the people there. He noted that all contemporary Nahua rituals have an end, or telos, in mind. So since then, the concept has expanded from Nahuatl teleologies, which I used during my dissertation, teleologies being goal-oriented behavior, trying to reach some kind of goal, to futurities, which is much more ample because futurities includes what you anticipate the future to be. So anticipations are also there. The concept, So I base Nahua futurities as a concept on the work of the Muskogee or Creek scholar Laura Harjo and her 2019 Spiral to the Stars, in which she presents indigenous futurities broadly and Muskogee futures specifically. Everything in the study focuses on knowledge, and the future, or imagining about the future, is a kind of knowledge about the future. It's anticipatory knowledge. One of the most pressing questions the Nahuas faced after the Spanish invasion was how to pass their knowledge on in the face of an uncertain future. The answers I have found to how they passed on knowledge I summarize as 5 Nahua tools of persuasion that they used to convince their communities to act to bring about futures of their choosing. This evening, the example I will give focuses on 2 of the tools of persuasion, repetition, and specific features of the Nahuatl language. After the conquest, Nahuas continued to use traditional pictorial techniques in the codices pictured here. They also quickly learned how to use the Latin alphabet to write manuscripts in their own language. The example that I take from the book here concerns the future of Nahua education. Before the conquest, Nahua nobles attended an institute called the Calmecac. And in the Calmecac, they were training you to be a part of the state apparatus, training you to be a ruler. And they had all these subjects: oratory, tekpili tlatoli, the noble speech you learned there, how to give the oratory, sacred songs. Almost everything that happened in the Calmecac was sung. They always used singing to help remember their knowledge and everything they had from their ancestors. And so that's a mnemonic device that kept it intact. You learned ancestral histories and genealogies. You learned reading and producing pictorial manuscripts and astronomy. So rulers were trained there, the Tlatoque, but also the painters, the Tlacuiloque, got their training in the Calmecac. The coming of the Spanish meant the end of ancestral methods of education. In fact, the day of the surrender of the capital of Tenochtitlan, August 13th, 1521, the emperor, the Hue Tlatoani Cuauhtemoc, surrendered to Hernán Cortés in the ruins of his own alma mater, the Calmecac he had attended as a young man in Tlatelolco, in the northern part of the city. This moment then serves as an emblem of the destruction of native education. But the Nahuas did not give up. 88 years later, 2 writers met in 1609 to collaborate on a history of the Mexica. Both were aware that as the last generation of those who remembered the days before the Spanish died off, as they went, their knowledge would go with them. Domingo Chimalpahin, from the town of Omecameca to the south of Tenochtitlan, worked in the city as a scribe and sacristan in the church of San Antonio de Abad. Fernando Alvarado Tezozomoc was the paternal grandson of Montezuma II, or Moctezuma Xocoyoc, who had worked for most of his life as a protected associate of the Spanish colonial administrators. He was there with the vice-regal court in the group of indigenous rulers that they brought in or incorporated or really rode on their local authority, the Spaniards did. He had already written a history at the Spanish Commission, or Spanish request, the Crónica Mexicana, but he did so in Spanish rather than Nahuatl. Together, Chimalpahin and Tezozomoc collaborated to write a history of the Mexica people in Nahuatl. This is the first page of it. While elders could still remember the words of the traditional stories sung in the Calmecac, Chimalpahin is the most prolific Amerindian writer, with some 1,500 folios in his handwriting. As an unpaid passion project, he traveled throughout central Mexico, writing histories of Nahua communities, even those of the Mexica, despite the fact that they had conquered his ancestors in Amecameca. Tezozomoc was over 70 years old at the time he spoke with Chimalpahin. Tezozomoc was the guardian of a repository of Mexica pictorial documents and likely dictated some of their contents to Chimalpahin. From this manuscript, I will draw examples to show how the collaborators used repetition to emphasize their points and specific features of the Nahuatl language to persuade their listeners or readers. Early in the manuscript, they speak directly to Mexica descendants. The term Huehuetlatoli is usually a name for wisdom sayings, and it appears as a descriptor of the accounts of the ancestors, stressing the wisdom of knowing one's origins. The doubled command form of Wel Shikakikan, Shikanakan, listen well to them, accept them, intensify the sense of duty to attend to the words of the manuscript. Again, they doubly address their audience in the second person plural as An Mexica, An Tenochca, you Mexica, and you Tenochca, the children, grandchildren, and posterity of the ruling class of Tenochtitlan, to emphasize the ability of future generations to guard the memory of their people. In Nahuatl, the doubling of a grammatical structure, like the one we just heard, An Mexica, An Tenochca, there are lots of other ones too, in Tlili and Tlapali, like we're going to look at in a little bit, in Xochitl and Cuicatl. These doublings convey larger meanings or metaphors wrapped together. So one of the meanings that occurs a few lines further down in the manuscript is the newly introduced technology of the bound book that will help preserve and convey knowledge. So the terms there, Wewe no tzatzi tlatoli, ini wewe nenot tzatzi amashtlaquiloli. These extended compound words emphasize the ancientness of the words in the accounts of the foundations of the city of Tenochtitlan, their wisdom, and that now their tlatoli, their words, would survive in the form of a manuscript book, an amochtlaquiloli, imagining a future when their descendants would remember their words, Tezozomoc and Chimalpahin, confidently affirm that they too will always guard them. In his golden years, Fernando Alvarado de Tezozomoc made his purpose to pass on what he knew of his ancestors and their achievements as the founders of one of the largest and most complex cities in the world at the time. He made it explicit. Tite palowan in tichekowan. We will go on telling of them. We will go on celebrating them. In all three of these passages, the repetition of future tenses, the use of difrasismos to convey rich meanings, and the use of compound words all work together as tools of persuasion that reveal Nahua futurities. They knew that their city was glorious. And even though some of these nobles had not been to Spain, some actually had, like the son of Malintzin and Cortés. Martin Cortés was educated in Spain, and then he returned to Mexico. And so he could compare in person what he knew of Mexico City with what he saw in Spain. And he saw that even after the conquest, it was a large and glorious city, rich and prosperous compared to what he saw in Europe. At this time, the largest cities in Spain have about maybe 50,000 people. But even after the conquest, Tenochtitlan supported far more, over 100,000. And they had good drainage, and they had good hygiene, and all these things that allowed them to have that large population. So, here's an overview of the chapters. In the first chapter, I examine two pictorials. The Lienzo de Cuauhquecholan, which comes from the town of, the historic name is Cuauhquecholan, and the contemporary name is Huaquechula, which is south of Atlixco in the state of Puebla. And then the Tira de Tepechpan, which if you're in Mexico City and you're on Avenida Insurgentes and you just keep driving northeast, that will turn into the highway that will take you to the pyramids, to Teotihuacan. And on the way, you will pass Tepexpan, which is Tepechpan, where they wrote this. It took them, it represents 300 years of record keeping that they did in Tepechpan, over 300. And so in that chapter, I'm really concerned with territory and agriculture, and also where to live in the future settlement. In the Lienzo de Cuauhtémoc, it's actually an alliance between the warriors of Cuauhtémoc with the Alvarado brothers, Jorge and Pedro, to go help take over Guatemala. And they were planning on taking over trade there. And how do we know this? There's lots of evidence in the Lienzo de Cuauhtémoc. The next chapter it concerns futurities of well-being in books 10 and 11 of the Florentine Codex. And in there, I'm showing that not only the healing practices, that they plan to continue those in years ahead and left detailed instructions, they're also planning on the office of the tisik, the healer, continuing. And I would say, as I've commented with some of you in the audience informally, that when you're in Mexico, you see the curandero. That's not an accident. Someone planned that, right? So it's not. I'm not claiming there's a direct line, but there is a certain echo, and there were historic plans that we can trace. And so in there we see how they continued to use their plant cures, and they planned on making that go forward into the future. Third chapter concerns politics. Since we know that the Spaniards are here to stay, what is effective in dealing with them and what is ineffective? And that's what this chapter is about. The Spaniards had first given the Mexica a tribute exemption for surrendering, but then they reneged. They changed their mind and started to charge a cash tribute. Everyone there was used to giving tribute in the form of some sort of species, food, quetzal feathers, or labor, but then it switched to silver. And so it was a very sly move by the Spaniards, because they took away their ability to gain that economic independence, taxing them, keeping them down. So they had to talk about, how are we going to deal with this? One of the successes that's in there was that they learned how to negotiate with the third party through the clergy, and they were able to get some tribute exemptions that way. And there are other amazing things in the chapter, like this religious rebellion of a man named Juan Teton. And he said that because you ate cow, and because you ate chickens, and because you ate sheep and all these imported animals, you're about to turn into those. And then the Tzitzimime, the demons that our ancestors said would come down from the sky and devour us, they're coming. And so that's in that chapter, which is amazing. And it's also knowledge about the future, how to survive, how the Spaniards came, and it seems like the world is ending. But even as Camilla Townsend, a great scholar at Rutgers, she said that the pages of the Anales de Juan Bautista, in spite of all the suffering, the pages are full of hope. And I thought, yeah, it's definitely true. So the one that we've just seen in this presentation, the Crónica Mexicayotl, it's all about the future of teaching, didactic horizons. And I argue in the book that what they managed to do by writing down the story of the Mexica was to produce a portable Calmecac. And they were somewhat successful, because we know the story of the Mexica, and this is one of the main sources of it. They wrote it down for future generations explicitly. And as I also mentioned to a couple of members in the audience, during, it was 1968, the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán from Mecha, they quote the Kronika Mexicayotl directly. And then back in the 18th century, the Jesuit Francisco Clavijero, he also quoted the Kronika Mexicayotl extensively. And it is in part, not all, as I explained in the book, it's in part because of the Kronika Mexicayotl that we have the Escudo de Mexico with the eagle eating the snake on top of a cactus. There's more to it, but in part it comes from that book that they wrote down. So that's the amazing futurity that made it. In the epilogue, I was able to interview my Nahua tutor, Eduardo de la Cruz, and another wonderful instructor from La Huasteca, Sabina de la Cruz. I analyzed an article that she did on a healing ritual that she participated in. And both of them taught me Nahuatl at different times. And it's amazing to see that they are still talking about the future and making plans. And this is an amazing part of empowerment and resilience in indigenous communities. And I can tell you from the epilogue that one of the parts that really impacted me the most was when Sabina says, you have to continue with the healing episodes because people will continue to hate and do damage to others. And so you have to heal that damage all the time. And if that's not talking about the future, I don't know what is.